The principle that we're going to be talking about today for intuitive eating is principle number 6, which has to do with feeling your fullness. And boy, is there a lot of fear in our clinic about feeling fullness. Diet culture will code fullness as something that is negative, bad, inherently wrong, right? Diet culture will say that fullness is that you're bloated, or you're inflamed, or you're gross, or you're gaining weight as a result of feeling full, and we tend to think that it's a negative experience that we should avoid at all costs. In reality, fullness is a completely normal part of human digestion. If we don't figure out how to feel comfortable with being full, we're never going to be able to be intuitive eaters. And more importantly, when we don't give ourselves permission to feel full, we're often going to continue to be preoccupied with food. We're going to be more receptive to thoughts about food, cues about food, advertising, smells, sounds, and we're just going to find that constantly there's some part in the back of our mind that's continually rolling about like when's the next meal, when the next snack is, and that is what really fuels and keeps going a negative relationship with food. So let's talk about a couple of barriers to fullness and work on those before we get to some tips at the end on how to start practicing feeling fullness more closely in your relationship to food. Barrier number 1, and this is the biggest one, by far what I hear more than anything else at our clinic. If I feel full, the only time I ever feel it is when I am uncomfortably full, stuffed, right? So this is an experience that happens for someone who is in a restrictive relationship to food, whether they are trying constantly to lose weight or whether they are trying and very, very scared to gain weight. They are typically going to be in a very restrictive relationship with food, constantly under eating, constantly depriving themselves of food, and therefore every time they come to a meal, they are having a lot of trouble regulating or controlling how much they eat at that time. Oftentimes when we are in a deprived state, our metabolic rate and our cues internally around food are going to skyrocket. Food's going to smell better, it's going to taste better, we're going to eat faster, we're going to chew faster. It almost sometimes feels like we can't control ourselves around it. And when we come to food in that deprived state and when we eat in that way, we often way overshoot fullness and go to that place of discomfort. And so what is really hard about that place is that for someone who's in a restrictive pattern, they're going to feel really, really bad about themselves for eating in that way. And they're going to kind of set up a pattern that, okay, next time I'm going to try to restrict even more, or I'm going to try to be even more careful around food because of how I ate last. They're going to set up that restriction cycle again, and then they're eventually going to get to that place where they are eating in an uncontrolled and very uncomfortable way again. It sets up this restrict binge cycle that, as you can see, is really, really painful and very hard to get out of. The second huge barrier around fullness is that if I feel full, it means I ate too much, right? This idea inherently that fullness equals too much. In diet culture, in disordered eating, oftentimes fullness means to that person, I didn't leave a deficit. And if I didn't leave a deficit, it means either I'm not going to lose weight or, oh my gosh, I might gain weight. That's a very kind of scarce mindset to be in. And it's impossible then to really start to understand and accept that, if you're an intuitive eater, fullness is a completely normal and appropriate part of the digestive process. It is the thing that when it happens, it completely quiets our internal energy regulation system. The enzymes, the hormones, the neurotransmitters, everything that's involved with appetite control in your body. When we feel full, all of that quiets. And then we get to stop thinking about food, we get to relax around it, and we get to go on and, enjoy the rest of our day until the next meal comes. So that's a huge, huge part and a huge barrier that people deal with as well. So now that we have our main 2 barriers, let's go into some of the tactics to start breaking down these barriers and being able to give yourself permission to feel appropriate fullness and become even more close to intuitive eating. First things first, honor your hunger, make peace with food, and work on identifying satisfaction in your relationship with food. Go back to our earlier videos, keep working on those earlier intuitive eating principles. The more closely you are honoring your hunger, eating on a normal schedule, really following a routine, finding foods that are satisfying and enjoyable to you, the better you are going to be able to come to meals in a more moderate and controlled appetite, and the better you are going to be able to sense your fullness, as opposed to coming to a more restricted, blowing way past fullness and feeling uncomfortable again. So, first tip, work on those earlier intuitive eating principles. Second tip, once you really feel anchored in those earlier principles, the next thing you want to really do is start to break fullness down. I recommend this to my clients all the time, into 3 categories, right? So we often always think of just like fullness is fullness. And if you're thinking about fullness as uncomfortable fullness, it's going to feel really good to start practicing that there might be 3 different levels to that we can start practicing looking for and assessing. So the first level of fullness is just enough. That's what I call it. Essentially, it is that you've eaten just enough to not feel hungry anymore, right? That hunger isn't kind of scratching away and insisting that you keep eating. You've gotten to a place where almost like you feel neutrality. You're not really hungry, but you're not necessarily full yet either. So that's number 1. That's the first kind of place to really start leveling up your awareness and noticing. The second place from there is when you get to a feeling of comfortable fullness. Ideally, there is a mental state of feeling like satisfied by the meal. Oh, that was good. That was delicious. I really enjoyed that. And then there should be a physical feeling of fullness that accompanies that. You notice it, it's there in your stomach, but it's not necessarily bad because your relationship with that meal was actually still pleasurable up to this point. And as you start to notice this, you are also going to hone in on, there are some moments here where if you do continue to eat, you're going to get to that feeling of uncomfortable fullness. Again, if you're coming to the meal like really, really hungry, it's going to be very hard to assess these minute subcategories. But practice coming to a meal, kind of moderate hunger, and noticing when you feel comfortably full and satisfied, and noticing, oh yeah, if I keep taking a couple bites, I'm going to start getting to that uncomfortable category. So here, I'm going to respect my fullness, I'm going to stop eating, and I'm going to say that I enjoyed the meal. So practice 3 layers of fullness. The next thing we have to assess is the difference between fullness and filled, okay? There's a lot of ways that you can fill your stomach without feeling actual satisfaction and fullness from a meal. And a lot of the ways that we hear people fill their stomach has to do with water, empty calories like fiber, fruits, vegetables, sometimes supplements. Caffeine is a great way to fill the stomach without actually feeling full. Air, so chewing gum or sucking on candy or anything like that that is not food can sometimes fill your stomach with air. That can give you a filled feeling, and that filled feeling can feel like I can't actually eat anything. I feel uncomfortable, I feel kind of bloated, I feel gross, and that is not fullness. Okay, fullness comes from a balance of macronutrients and micronutrients, right? So water, vitamins, minerals, but also fiber, carbohydrates, fats. And if your body doesn't get those in appropriate quantity and in appropriate distribution, again, that piece of your mind, even though you feel filled from what you've put in your stomach, that mind is going to just keep chugging away and sending out signals for foods that it still needs and wants. Your body is very highly attuned to what it requires for survival, and the mind will keep asking for that even when you have an uncomfortably filled stomach. So that's the next piece. Really assess and notice when you are full versus when you are filled. Next thing to work on, how long does a meal last you? This is another really good way to assess fullness. So let's say you have a breakfast meal, you absolutely love it, you enjoy it, you get a lot of satisfaction about eating it. But then maybe around 10:30, maybe 11 o'clock, you find yourself thinking about food again, right? Do I have a snack? Did I bring something? Should I have something? Should I wait until lunch? I kind of want lunch earlier. Maybe I should have lunch at 11. I shouldn't feel hungry for an early lunch. I had breakfast already. And you get into this loop, right? It just means that maybe that meal, even if it was really satisfying to you, it didn't quite have that nutritional component that your body needed to really fully feel quiet around food. And there's a couple ways to address it. You can really notice if that's a pattern all the time, that no matter what meal of the day, you're kind of feeling ready for food before the next meal is supposed to come, right? Maybe that 4 or 5 hour mark. It could mean that you need to level up the size of your meals by adding a little bit more fat, adding a little bit different of a carbohydrate, maybe adding more protein. Or it could be that you just like the meal the way you like it, and then you might need to provide a little bit of extra nutrition support to go along with that. So you might need to add a little bit bigger of a snack between meals, or you might want to have your next meal a little bit earlier and making sure that it's filling and satisfying. There's nothing wrong with any of this, except that you give yourself permission to adjust your meals accordingly so that you can feel more full and more satisfied from that meal and stop thinking about food, right? That's what helps us give us a better relationship with food over the long term. Okay, last tip, and my favorite tip of all, is that maybe overeating is actually not something that we have to worry about, and actually maybe it's not inherently terrible and awful. For sure, for people who are eating to discomfort and eating and feeling overly full as a foundational element to how they feed themselves, we definitely want to work with that person, right? Feeling full and disgusting all the time, quote unquote disgusting, feeling full and gross all the time from overeating and feeling like you don't have control. We definitely want to help that person moderate their eating, time it a little bit better, eat more filling meals earlier in the day to feel more satisfied. But situationally, sometimes overeating is just an expression of joy in the moment, right? You love the people you're with, you love the meal that you're having, you love the celebration that you're enjoying, and it does not mean that eating past fullness in that moment is something that you did that's bad, that you're out of control, that you're not healthy. It is not inherently a bad thing to overeat on occasion. So make peace with those moments where overeating or eating past fullness is kind of a part of the celebratory process and part of the human experience. And I hope these tips have helped you think a little bit more deeply about your own experience of fullness and help you take on some of the challenges in that relationship. Definitely work on this with a professional if you feel like it's something good that you can take to a dietitian or an eating related therapist, and I will see you in the next principle.